being pierced. Now, my dad was a very hard-headed engineer, and when that ended and we walked out, I mean, he thought he had given us this, this afternoon that was incredible privilege, and in fact, it was. It was sort of a neat thing to see, notwithstanding how troubling it was to see this man and several other men being crucified. So he turned to Connie and said, "Connie, I don't know why you're acting like this. He's just being crucified." And she said, "Ray, that's my Lord. They were killing my Lord. How else should I respond?" And he says, "Well, you shouldn't be troubled." And she said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because we also have scenes of the resurrection." And she said, "You do?" And he said, "Yeah, when we found them, I showed them to the guys in my group, and they were so moved by it, but that even some of the non-believers were saying things like, 'Oh, praise be to God.'" And Connie said, "Can I see it, Ray? Can I see it?" And he goes, "Well, no, I can tell you about it." And she said, "Tell me about it." And he said, "Well, there's a flash of light, and two angels appear in white, and Jesus stands up." I think he said there's a flash of white, and Jesus stands up, and then two angels appear in his crypt, and they push the rock away, and he walks out of the crypt. And and Connie said, "Oh, Ray, you're going to have to let me see that." And he said, "You can't. We can't let you." And she said, "Why not?" And he said, "You're not cleared for the resurrection." This is the actual conversation as we're walking out of this viewing room at the Sandia Labs. So I've thought about that over the years, and I thought, well, that would establish that would be looking at the resurrection of Jesus as documentary footage, which would clearly have an impact on people's religious beliefs. And when I've thought about why they've sequestered such cosmic secrets, such arguably sacred secrets to Christian adherents, it has to be the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution forbids the United States government from either establishing a religion or preventing the free exercise thereof. And I believe that when something as sensitive as scenes of the resurrection of Jesus was vetted by the intelligence community and run through the think tanks and so forth, they concluded that it would not be appropriate to show that footage to the people of the world, because it would be tantamount to the U.S. government sort of encouraging people to adopt Christianity as their faith.
Yes.
But that's the sensitive nature of the quantum access they have. They are going to be able to go back and resolve historical mysteries, just even much more mundane ones. They would be able to, let's say, trace Amelia Earhart's plane ride and see where she crashed or what happened to her.
I mean, this is incredibly interesting. I mean, absolutely. But the difficulty here, as I see it, as well, on top of this, is yet after all of this, how can this be verified? I mean, to play devil's advocate here, this could be a scene that were played out in one way, given to enforce religious belief, even if it is to those who only at this point in time are privileged to see it. Could not this also be used to manipulate and construct history, because they could go out and say, this is the final definite version of what actually happened in history, but how can we verify that?
I think what you said is very true, and in fact, there were 600 men crucified in the same manner that Jesus was, right in the several years of his public ministry. So in fact, I've asked, how did they know that was Jesus of Nazareth?
Yes.
They would have had a set of men doing different things, 2,000 years ago, and then they would have said, oh, well, this leads to this public torture and his crucifixion on, Golgotha. It may have been somebody else. So maybe one of the objections that was raised to releasing footage of the crucifixion was that they weren't sure that it was Jesus, and also that people should have the freedom to reach their religious conclusions or their religious orientation, or even their own atheism or agnosticism in their own way, and not have it be induced as a result of a technical capacity of a government.
Yeah.
I think it's a very sensitive issue, and I think that you're right. Another thing, you also kind of point up one of the threats to validity of Chronovision, and that is, if you have an organization like the U.S. government, let's say that we established a Chronovision museum at the National Archives in Washington, where you could go in and see the Battle of Runnymede, or watch the terracotta statues at Xi'an in China being buried, being manufactured and buried,
yes.
what have you.
Yes.
The danger is that the organization purporting that it's the actual past would have to be trusted to be showing a past event rather than a motion picture.
Yes.
Rather than a fictional depiction. And so it does confer incredible power to those who are in possession of quantum access. And I think in the same way that they determined that they shouldn't play God and change future events based on quantum access to them, they also determined that they wouldn't subvert the ordinary person's understanding of history by accentuating the sensate, broadcasting of past events that have remained sort of murky. I mean, there's a tremendous religious impact, philosophical, psychological, and social, and there's always the threat that a corrupt government will use what's shown in Chronovision in either direction for propaganda purposes.
Yes, exactly.
You could have a dictator who would show scenes of some benighted future that'll happen if you support his or her policies. So it's a very dangerous and destabilizing technology, but what I would like to see is some kind of commission where you'd have, major historians, representatives of the public, maybe representatives of the clergy, maybe representatives of certain scientific groups, certainly leading historians, having the responsibility just to release certain inspiring scenes from the past, because I think that would reignite the interests of younger people, for example, in history, which is a very important discipline that has fallen not into disrepute, but fallen out of favor. People were inspired just seeing Ken and Rick Burns' The Civil War. Imagine if you could see what a Civil War battle was like via Chronovision.
Yes.
By a trip to Washington, D.C. in 2010. So I do think it's a technology that could transform the world in that way. But yes, there certainly are ethical and philosophical considerations that indicate that maybe it shouldn't be used when what hangs in the balance is people's own inherent understanding of reality, their religious beliefs, and so on.
Have they continued this program? Do you think at that point that they have a quote-unquote correct chronology of history at this point?
I'm almost certain of it, because one of the first things we did relative to Chronovision, even before we were placed in the Chronovisor holograms to see what was in them as virtual time travel, beginning in fall of 1970. During that first year, I was in the learning lab of 1969-70. I was in the third grade. That fall, actually no, it was the fall of 70 when we were introduced to Chronovision. Before we were actually traveled in time via Chronovision, virtually speaking. They took us to a national security watch post at Flemington, New Jersey, and that's where I was shown on an 8-inch circular screen the signing of the U.S. Constitution. That's why I use it as an example. Mm-hmm. And the technician pointed out George Washington and Benjamin Franklin in the image. I couldn't make out Washington very well, but I clearly could see Benjamin Franklin in the image. He was very large and had a very magnificent, almost domed head. He was a very unusual-looking man. Mm. And, of course, he was around 81 years old at that September 1787 meeting where they signed the U.S. Constitution. Okay. Mm. At that national security watch post, the technicians were recording past events and filming them, and then removing these 16-millimeter film reels and putting them in canisters and stacking them. Okay, so they were actively filming a huge amount of past information right there in fall of 1970. So I think your question is essentially, has the U.S. Defense Department and by extension the U.S. government mapped much of the past and probably significant scenes from the future? Yes, I believe it has. I don't know if the project is ongoing. It probably is. But they were already filming reams and reams and reams of holograms of past events. At that facility, they were propagating the TV screen-like images, and then they clearly had some mechanism in the device to send those images, to film those images onto 16-millimeter film and then place them in canisters and store them.
Yes.
Essentially, everybody in the facility it was a small facility, but there were like 8 guys in white lab coats who were essentially the gnomes that were doing that. They were the white-suited technicians who had the boring job of just filming the past all day long. Well, I don't know if at that point they were filming the future, because when we first were involved in Chronovision, almost the entire thrust was the past.
Yeah.
But, the past has been filmed. So I assume that large parts of of the future have been mapped as well. Actually, let me mention a brief anecdote about that.
Yes.
The reason